There is a specific kind of silence that falls over a council chamber when every delegate in the room has just realized, at roughly the same moment, that the vote they are about to cast no longer matters. It is not the silence of consensus, and it is not the silence of defeat. It is the silence of a body discovering that the crisis it convened to manage has already been resolved, hours earlier, by someone who never bothered to wait for its permission. The Voss Concord's governing chamber experienced that particular silence exactly once in its 412-year history, and the recording of it, 11 seconds of dead air, captured by the chamber's own archival systems and never officially released beyond the Concord's highest levels, remains, to this day, the single most requested and most heavily restricted document in the Concord's entire administrative archive. To understand how a council convened specifically to prevent a catastrophe could conclude its business 6 hours after the catastrophe had already, quietly and almost bloodlessly, resolved itself, you first have to understand the thing the Voss Concord was proudest of, the very quality its founders had built into its governing structure 4 centuries earlier specifically to prevent the kind of rash, unilateral decision-making that had nearly destroyed 3 of its founding member worlds in a war fought before the Concord existed to prevent it. Consensus. Every decision of consequence, every fleet deployment, every diplomatic ultimatum, every formal declaration regarding a species newly encountered, required the assent of no fewer than 9 of the Concord's 11-seated delegates, a threshold so deliberately difficult to clear that the Concord's own founding charter described it, without apparent irony, as the price of never again allowing a single frightened voice to speak for us all. For 390 years, that threshold had served the Concord well. It had prevented 3 separate wars that impatient minorities within the chamber had, at various points, argued urgently for. It had produced, across 4 centuries, a diplomatic record considerably cleaner than almost any comparable power in the region, a record the Concord's own delegates cited, often and with genuine pride, as proof that patience, properly institutionalized, was a form of strength rather than weakness. What none of those delegates fully understood, on the morning an unremarkable border dispute at a mining outpost called Threndell's Rest began escalating faster than any prior crisis in the Concord's history, was that the same deliberative architecture built to prevent one kind of catastrophe had never once been tested against a crisis that moved at the speed this one was about to move at, and that the species standing on the other side of it had already, quietly and for reasons entirely its own, decided it did not intend to wait for the Concord to catch up. Threndell's Rest was not, by any conventional measure, a significant location. It was a modest mining and refueling waypoint at the edge of a border region the Voss Concord shared, uneasily and by treaty, with a young human colonial administration barely 40 years into its own tentative expansion beyond the home system. The outpost's population numbered fewer than 11,000, split roughly evenly between Voss administrative staff, and a small human contingent operating a refueling contract under an agreement both governments had negotiated with considerable diplomatic effort 6 years earlier. It was, in the words of the Concord's own regional assessment, a minor point of productive cooperation between 2 species still learning the shape of each other, and no one in the Concord's governing chamber had spent any meaningful time, in the years since that assessment was filed, seriously considering what might happen if cooperation there ever broke down. It began, as these things so often do, with a single officer who believed he understood the situation better than the treaty he had been assigned to enforce. Battalion Commander Resic Dorvain had held his post at Threndel's Rest for just under 2 years, a posting his own service record described, with the particular blandness of institutional language, as steady, unremarkable, and consistent with expectations for an officer of his experience level. A description Dorvain himself had come, across those 2 years, to resent with an intensity his superiors never fully appreciated. He had entered Concord military service 22 years earlier, believing his career would carry him toward the kind of decisive, consequential command that shaped the Concord's broader strategic posture, and he had instead spent the better part of 2 decades in a series of postings, the Concord's own promotion boards politely characterized as developmental, watching officers with less field experience, but considerably more patience for the Concord's glacial concerns. Us culture advance passed him toward exactly the kind of command he had once believed himself destined for. He had grown, across those 2 years at Threndel's Rest, increasingly and privately convinced that the human refueling contingent under his nominal jurisdiction operated with a confidence he found disproportionate to their actual standing. A confidence he read, in his own private assessments, as evidence of a species that had not yet been taught the appropriate deference a smaller, younger power owed the Concords considerably greater seniority in the region. He had filed, across those same 2 years, no fewer than 6 formal requests to his own chain of command, seeking expanded authority to enforce stricter compliance with the letter of the refueling treaty. Requests that had, each time, been reviewed, discussed, and ultimately declined by superiors who saw no evidence the existing arrangement required the kind of tightening Dorvain believed it did. It was this accumulated, unaddressed frustration, more than any single triggering incident, that produced the decision Dorvain made on an otherwise unremarkable morning 6 standard weeks before the crisis that would eventually occupy the Concord's full governing chamber. Acting on his own authority, without seeking the approval his own regulations technically required for an action of this scale, he ordered the detention of a human refueling vessel and its 11-person crew on grounds his own subsequent report described as suspected treaty violation pending further investigation, grounds that a later, considerably more thorough review would find rested on evidence so thin as to be functionally non-existent. The human refueling administrator at Threndel's Rest, a quiet, methodical woman named Priya Anand, who had spent 4 years building the kind of careful, incremental working relationship with her Voss counterparts that made genuine cooperation between 2 very different species possible at all, received notice of the detention with a controlled alarm she did not allow to show in her formal response. "Commander Dorvain," she wrote, in the message she transmitted within the hour, "I would ask that you release the detained crew and vessel immediately, and that we resolve whatever concern has prompted this action through the review process our existing treaty specifically establishes for exactly this purpose. I would remind you that unilateral detention absent that process constitutes, under the treaty's own terms, a serious breach, and I do not believe either of our governments benefits from allowing a misunderstanding to escalate into something considerably more consequential than it needs to be." Dorvain's reply, when it came, offered her no meaningful reassurance. "The detention will remain in effect pending a full investigation, Administrator. I would remind you that this outpost operates under Concord jurisdiction, and that your government's own treaty obligations require cooperation with that jurisdiction's legitimate exercise, whatever your own characterization of its legitimacy in this instance." What followed across the next several hours was the specific, accelerating sequence of events that would later occupy the Concord's own crisis timeline in exhaustive, minute-by-minute detail. A sequence that began with a single overreaching officer's unauthorized detention of 11 civilians and ended, 6 hours later, in a resolution the Concord's own governing chamber would not learn about until it had already, irrevocably, occurred. Annan's first action, once Dorvain's refusal made clear that diplomatic appeal to the local commander would produce no immediate result, was to transmit a formal incident report through her own government's colonial administrative channel, a report that reached the desk of Regional Administrator Marcus Webb, overseeing the human colonial government's broader border operations from an administrative station 4 light hours from Threndel's Rest, within roughly 90 minutes of the initial detention. Webb, a career administrator whose own service record bore little resemblance to the kind of dramatic command experience that populated most accounts of human-alien first contact, read Annan's report with the particular, focused calm of an official who had spent considerable time, across his own career, preparing for exactly this kind of situation without ever quite expecting to actually encounter it. He did not, in the minutes following his review of the report, convene an extended committee, request additional confirming intelligence, or seek authorization from any body beyond his own existing, standing authority. He activated, instead, a protocol his own administration had developed and refined across the preceding decade, specifically for border incidents involving the detention of human civilians by a foreign power's local officer acting outside properly sanctioned authority. A protocol built, like so much of humanity's broader interstellar posture, on the same foundational principle that had governed Earth's defense doctrine for the better part of a century, that a crisis moving faster than a deliberative body's normal processing speed required a response built for that speed, prepared and rehearsed long before the actual crisis ever arrived, rather than improvised under pressure once it did. I want the response vessel already staged at Carvon Station moving toward Threndel's Rest within the hour, Webb told his own senior staff, in the brief operational meeting that followed his review of Annan's report. I want a formal diplomatic protest transmitted simultaneously to the Vos Concord's regional consulate, citing the specific treaty provisions Commander Dorvain's action violates. And I want it clearly understood in every communication we send that our intention is the immediate, peaceful release of our detained personnel, not escalation beyond what this specific incident requires. This is a contained problem created by one officer's overreach. I intend for our response to remain exactly as contained as the problem itself, provided the Vos Concord's own broader command structure allows it to remain that way. The vessel Webb dispatched, a modest, unremarkable-looking transport registered under a designation that gave no external indication of its actual capability, arrived in orbit above Threndel's Rest just under 4 hours after the initial detention, a response time that Commander Dorvain, monitoring its approach from his own station's sensors, found difficult to immediately reconcile with everything his own service's institutional assessment of human capability had led him to expect. The vessel's registered classification indicates a standard transport, unarmed, consistent with routine logistics operations, his own sensor officer reported, reviewing the approaching craft's transponder data with the particular, unquestioning confidence of an officer who had never had cause to seriously doubt what a ship's registered classification actually told him about its true capability. I see no indication this represents an escalation beyond diplomatic protest, Commander. I would recommend we treat its arrival as a formality rather than a genuine operational concern. Dorvain, watching the same approach data with an unease he did not fully articulate even to his own staff, found himself considering, for the first time since ordering the detention, whether his own confident assessment of the situation's manageable scale might have been built on foundations considerably less solid than he had assumed. He had, across 2 years at Threndel's Rest, absorbed the same broad institutional characterization of human capability that shaped every conquered officer's understanding of the species. Younger, smaller, technologically adequate but unremarkable. A power whose diplomatic caution reflected genuine strategic limitation rather than deliberate restraint. He had not, in the 6 weeks since his own accumulated frustration finally produced the detention order, seriously entertained the possibility that this characterization might be, in ways his own career had never equipped him to recognize, fundamentally incomplete. It was roughly 90 minutes after that transport's arrival in orbit, and just under 5.5 hours after the initial detention, that Commander Dorvain received a transmission he would later describe, in the extensive disciplinary review that followed the entire incident, as the moment he finally understood how badly he had miscalculated. Though by the time that transmission arrived, the miscalculation in question had already, functionally, been resolved. The transmission came not from Regional Administrator Webb, and not from any diplomatic channel Dorvain's own training had prepared him to expect a resolution to arrive through, but from the transport vessel itself, now holding position in a stable orbit directly above the outpost's own detention facility, close enough that its presence registered on every instrument aboard Dorvain's own station with an unambiguous, deliberate visibility that offered no room for the kind of comfortable misreading his sensor officer's earlier assessment had allowed. "Commander Dorvain," the voice that opened the channel said, calm, unhurried, carrying none of the diplomatic hedging Dorvain had expected from a formal human protest. "My name is Captain Renata Okonkwo, commanding officer of this vessel. I am transmitting to inform you that the 11 detained personnel currently held at your facility will be released within the next 30 minutes. I am not requesting this release, Commander. I am informing you, as a courtesy, of an outcome that is already in the process of occurring, because I believe a courtesy of this kind reduces the risk of any further misunderstanding between us in the minutes that follow." Dorvain, listening to this transmission with a mounting, specific alarm his own 2 decades of service had never once prepared him to manage, found himself asking the question his own training told him was the only relevant one remaining. "Captain, I would remind you that this facility remains under active Concord defensive coverage, and that any attempt at unauthorized retrieval of detained personnel will be treated as a hostile act against conquered sovereign territory. I do not believe your vessel's classification suggests you possess the capability to make good on whatever action you are describing without triggering exactly the kind of escalation your own government has spent the last several hours claiming it wishes to avoid." There was a pause on the channel, brief, and to Dorvain's own trained ear, entirely unhurried, the pause of someone who had expected precisely this response and had already decided, well before the conversation began, exactly how she intended to answer it. "Commander, I would ask you to check your own facility's internal security systems before you finish that sentence." What Dorvain found, when his own staff urgently pulled the facility's internal monitoring feeds in the seconds that followed, was a detention block whose external security systems, robust enough to have registered any conventional attempted breach the moment it began, showed no record whatsoever of any incursion, and whose internal holding cells, according to the same feeds, no longer contained the 11 detained personnel his own morning's order had placed there. "Commander, I am showing the detention block as currently empty," his own security officer reported, his voice carrying the specific, unpracticed strain of someone delivering information his own instruments had needed to verify 3 separate times before he trusted himself to state it aloud. "I have no record of any breach, no record of any unauthorized entry, and no explanation for how 11 detained personnel could currently be absent from a facility our own systems show as having remained continuously secure throughout the relevant period." Dorvin opened the channel to Captain Okonkwo again, his own voice carrying, for the first time in the exchange, something closer to the alarm his subordinates had already begun to feel. "Captain, I would ask you directly what capability your vessel has demonstrated in the last several minutes, because I do not currently possess any framework for understanding what my own instruments are telling me." "I don't think that framework is mine to provide you, Commander," Okonkwo answered, "and I don't believe this is the appropriate moment for that particular conversation regardless. What I can tell you is that the 11 personnel your facility detained 6 hours ago are, as of this transmission, safely aboard my own vessel, unharmed, and that my orders are to depart this system the moment their safety is fully confirmed, without further incident, provided your own forces do not attempt to prevent that departure. I would strongly recommend, Commander, that your forces not attempt to prevent that departure." Dorvin, standing in his own command center surrounded by staff whose earlier confidence had, within the span of a single transmission, collapsed into a silence considerably more unsettled than anything 2 years of routine posting had prepared any of them to manage, gave the only order his own rapidly reassessing judgment could produce. "Stand down. Allow the vessel's departure. I want a full report on our facility's security failure prepared for transmission to Regional Command within the hour. And I want it to include, in full and without any attempt at characterization favorable to my own prior decisions, exactly how a detention I ordered 6 hours ago concluded with the detained personnel's release, accomplished by means our own systems apparently could not even detect, let alone prevent." It was roughly at the moment Captain Okonkwo's transport cleared the outer boundary of Threndel's Rest's own defensive perimeter, its departure logged without incident by Concord sensors that had, throughout the preceding half-hour, registered no meaningful trace of whatever capability had actually retrieved the detained personnel, that the crisis reached the desk of the Voss Concord's own governing chamber for the first time, roughly 5 hours and 40 minutes after Commander Dorvin's original unauthorized order, and though no one in the chamber yet understood this, mere minutes before the entire situation, the chamber was about to spend the next several hours urgently debating, would already have concluded, in every practical sense, without any input from them at all. Presiding Delegate Yendra Thal, the Concord's most senior sitting official, and the officer whose responsibility it was to convene any emergency session the Chamber's own procedures classified as warranting immediate attention, received the initial incident report from the Concord's regional consulate with a controlled urgency that reflected both her genuine concern about the situation's implications and her own considerable experience navigating exactly the kind of procedural machinery that was, even as she read the report, already beginning to slow the Chamber's response to a pace the crisis itself had long since outrun. "I am convening an emergency session of this Chamber, effective immediately, to address a detention incident at the border outpost designated Threndel's Rest, involving 11 human civilian personnel held by Concord military authority acting, according to this initial report, without proper sanction from regional command. She announced, to the 11 delegates assembling, with the particular unhurried formality the chamber's own procedures required regardless of the situation's actual urgency. Across the following 40 minutes, as each delegate was individually notified, confirmed their attendance, and made their way to the chamber from wherever the notification had reached them. The convening of that session alone, the simple, procedural act of assembling all 11 delegates in a single chamber, verifying quorum and formally opening deliberation, consumed nearly an hour, a duration that reflected not any particular negligence on the part of the Concord's administrative staff, but the ordinary, unremarkable operation of a governing structure built, deliberately and by design, to prioritize thoroughness over speed in exactly the kind of high-stakes deliberation the Chamber's founders had believed, 4 centuries earlier, deserved considerably more caution than urgency ever warranted. Delegate Corvin Ashit, representing one of the Concord's more militarily assertive member worlds, opened the substantive debate with a position that several of his colleagues in the chamber had, across prior sessions involving other border disputes, come to expect from him. I would move that this chamber authorize an immediate diplomatic ultimatum to the human colonial administration, demanding the immediate release of the detained personnel and a formal apology for whatever provocation prompted Commander Dorvain's action, with the explicit understanding that failure to comply within a specified window will be met with proportional military response. I do not believe this chamber can afford to appear indecisive in a matter involving the detention of civilians, regardless of which side's officer initiated the underlying dispute. Delegate Murin Voss, representing the Concord's founding world and generally regarded, across the chamber, as the body's most consistent voice for procedural caution, offered an immediate and characteristic objection. I would remind Delegate Ashit that our own initial report indicates Commander Dorvain's detention order was issued without proper sanction from his own regional command, a detail that considerably complicates any narrative in which this chamber positions itself as the aggrieved party demanding apology from the human administration. I would move, instead, that this chamber first seek a full accounting of Commander Dorvain's own authority to issue the detention order before considering any response directed at the human government, since it is entirely possible this chamber is about to demand an apology for an action our own officer had no legitimate standing to take in the first place. The debate that followed, spanning the better part of 2 additional hours, proceeded along lines that would have been entirely familiar to any Concord delegate who had sat through the chamber's prior deliberations on matters of comparable sensitivity. Careful, methodical, genuinely committed to reaching a decision, the full weight of the Concord's institutional caution could stand behind, and almost entirely disconnected in its pacing from the actual speed at which the underlying crisis had already, unbeknownst to every delegate in the room, resolved itself. Delegate Thessa Corvin, representing a smaller member world whose own historical experience with hasty, conquered military action during the pre-founding wars, had shaped her particular sensitivity to exactly this kind of debate, raised a caution that several of her colleagues found, in retrospect, considerably more prescient than anyone in the chamber initially credited it as being. I would ask this chamber to consider a possibility none of us have yet raised, she said, roughly 90 minutes into the session, as the debate continued to circle without resolution around the question of whether an ultimatum, an apology demand, or a more measured diplomatic inquiry represented the chamber's most appropriate response. We are currently debating, at considerable length, how this chamber ought to respond to a crisis that has now been actively unfolding for nearly 6 hours. I would ask whether anyone in this chamber has considered what may already have transpired at Threndel's Rest in the time we have spent debating our own response, and whether our eventual decision, however carefully reasoned, risks arriving at a situation that has already moved considerably beyond whatever state our own initial report described. Delegate Ashit, whose earlier call for a swift ultimatum had itself been delayed by nearly 2 hours of exactly the deliberative process Corvin was now questioning, offered a response that reflected the Chamber's broader institutional confidence in its own procedural rigor. I understand the concern, Delegate Corvin, but I would suggest this Chamber's careful deliberation is precisely the discipline that has served the conquered reliably across 4 centuries of governance. A crisis resolved hastily, without this Chamber's full and considered judgment behind it, risks producing exactly the kind of unilateral miscalculation that created this situation in the first place. I do not believe speed, for its own sake, represents the correct institutional response to Commander Dorvain's own failure of patience. It was a position the majority of the chamber found, in the moment, entirely reasonable, and the debate continued for a further 2 hours along much the same careful, methodical lines, weighing the relative merits of an ultimatum against a more measured diplomatic inquiry, considering the precise language any eventual communication to the human administration ought to employ, and debating at some length whether the Chamber's response ought to address Commander Dorvain's own conduct directly or route any disciplinary consideration through a separate, internal conquered military review process, entirely distinct from whatever diplomatic communication the Chamber ultimately authorized. It was presiding Delegate Thal herself, reviewing an updated situation report that had arrived from the Concord's regional consulate roughly 3.5 hours into the session, who first recognized the full, uncomfortable scope of what the Chamber's careful deliberation had actually cost it. I have just received an updated report from our regional consulate, she said, and the particular, controlled stillness in her voice was sufficient to bring the Chamber's ongoing debate to an immediate halt, every delegate present recognizing, from long experience with her manner, that whatever she was about to say carried weight considerably beyond the routine procedural updates the Chamber typically received mid-session. The detained personnel at Threndel's Rest were released, according to this report, approximately 5 hours and 40 minutes after the original detention order, which is to say, this report indicates the personnel in question were already safely returned to human custody before this Chamber's emergency session was even formally convened, let alone before we began the deliberation we have just spent the last 3.5 hours conducting. The silence that followed that announcement was, by the account of every delegate later interviewed for the Concord's own internal review of the incident, unlike anything any of them had previously experienced within the Chamber's 400-year history. Not the silence of shock at some external catastrophe, but the specific, disorienting silence of a body realizing that its own most fundamental operating assumption, that its deliberation existed to shape and resolve the crisis under discussion, had simply never been true in this particular instance. The crisis had not waited for the Chamber. It had run its entire course, from provocation to resolution, in less time than the Chamber had required merely to convene, and every subsequent hour of careful, methodical debate had addressed a situation that no longer, in any practical sense, existed. I would ask, Delegate Corvin said, into that silence, her own voice carrying a quality that several colleagues later described as more sorrow than vindication, though her earlier caution had proven, in the most literal possible sense, correct. Whether this chamber intends to continue debating an appropriate response to a crisis that has already concluded without us, or whether we might instead use the time remaining in this session to consider what it means for this Concord's broader institutional standing. That a crisis of this magnitude resolved itself entirely outside our own deliberative process, while that process continued in good faith, believing itself still relevant to an outcome that had already, hours earlier, been decided by someone else. The full account of how the 11 detained personnel had actually been retrieved from a supposedly secure Concord detention facility, an account that reached the chamber only in the days following the emergency session, once Concord intelligence officers completed their own considerably more thorough review of Threndel's Rest's compromised security logs, produced within the chamber, a second, and in some ways more unsettling reckoning than the first, because it revealed that the 6-hour gap between provocation and resolution had not been the product of unusual speed on the human administration's part, so much as the ordinary, practiced operation of a response capability the human colonial government had developed and rehearsed specifically for incidents of exactly this kind, long before Threndel's Rest ever became the site where that capability was actually tested. Regional Administrator Webb, in the formal diplomatic communication his own government eventually transmitted to the Concord once the crisis had fully concluded, offered an account considerably more candid than protocol strictly required, and candor that several Concord delegates later noted, with some private discomfort, seemed calibrated less toward apology than toward a particular kind of instructive clarity. I want to be direct with your government about what occurred at Threndel's Rest, and why it occurred at the pace it did, Webb's communication read, once translated and circulated among the chamber's full membership. Our colonial administration maintains standing response protocols for border incidents involving unauthorized detention of civilian personnel, protocols developed and refined across the preceding decade, specifically because our own experience, across a difficult early history of contact with other spacefaring powers, taught us that crises of this kind rarely wait for a deliberative body's normal processing speed, however careful and well-intentioned that body's eventual judgment might be. Captain Okonkwo's vessel was already staged and ready to respond before Commander Dorvain's detention order was even issued, not because we anticipated this specific incident, but because we have learned, at some historical cost, to maintain that kind of readiness continuously, against contingencies we cannot always predict in advance. I do not offer this explanation to suggest any criticism of your own government's deliberative processes, which I understand reflect values considerably important to the Concord's own institutional identity. I offer it because I believe your government deserves an honest account of why our response arrived at the speed it did, rather than allowing your own chamber to conclude, incorrectly, that some deficiency in your notification or communication procedures was responsible for a gap your deliberative process was, in truth, never actually positioned to close. Delegate Ashett, reading this communication in the follow-up session, the Chamber convened specifically to address its own institutional response to the incident, found himself confronting the particular discomfort of an official whose earlier confident position, that careful deliberation represented an unqualified institutional virtue, regardless of the pace at which any given crisis actually unfolded, had been directly and specifically contradicted by an outcome he had not anticipated and could not now easily dismiss. I want to acknowledge, before this chamber, that my own position during our emergency session reflected an assumption I no longer believe this incident allows me to comfortably hold," he said. "I argued that this chamber's careful process represented the appropriate institutional discipline regardless of the pace at which the underlying crisis moved. I did not adequately consider that a crisis capable of resolving itself, in its entirety, before our own deliberation had even formally begun, represents a category of situation our existing procedures were simply never designed to meaningfully address. And I do not believe continued insistence on our existing pace, applied without modification to crises of this speed, serves this Concord's genuine interests going forward." Presiding Delegate Thal, whose own responsibility for convening the session placed her at the center of the Chamber's subsequent institutional reckoning, undertook, in the months following the incident, a review considerably more searching than the Concord's own standard post-crisis procedure typically required, examining not merely the specific sequence of decisions that had produced the 6-hour delay, but the broader structural question of whether the Concord's foundational consensus threshold, the 9 of 11 requirement that had served the body reliably across 4 centuries of more conventional deliberation, remained appropriate for a strategic environment that now, for the first time in the Concord's history, included a neighboring power whose own crisis response capability operated on a timescale the Chamber's existing structure could not, in practice, ever hope to match. "I do not believe this Chamber's founding principle was wrong," she told the assembled delegates, in the address that formally opened the Concord's broader institutional review, some months after the incident. "I believe our founders were entirely correct that unchecked, unilateral speed produced catastrophic decisions in the era before this Concord existed, and I do not propose we abandon the deliberative caution that has, across 4 centuries, prevented us from repeating those catastrophes. What I propose, instead, is that this chamber recognize a distinction our founders, working in an era before any neighboring power possessed the kind of standing, rehearsed rapid response capability the human colonial administration has evidently developed, had no occasion to anticipate. That some crises move at a pace no deliberative body, however wise its eventual judgment, can realistically hope to keep pace with, and that a chamber unwilling to acknowledge this distinction risks finding itself, again and again, precisely where we found ourselves at Threndell's Rest, debating, in good faith and at considerable length, a resolution to a crisis that concluded itself hours before our debate even began. The reform the chamber eventually adopted, following nearly a year of further deliberation that several delegates noted, with a certain rueful self-awareness, proceeded at exactly the careful, unhurried pace the crisis itself had just demonstrated the limits of, established a new category of emergency authority, a standing delegation of limited, clearly bounded decision-making power to a rotating panel of 3 senior officials, empowered to authorize immediate, provisional diplomatic or defensive action in precisely the narrow category of fast-moving border incidents. The Threndell's Rest crisis had revealed the full chamber structurally incapable of addressing in time, with any such provisional action subject to full chamber review and potential reversal within a fixed subsequent window. It was, several delegates acknowledged during the reform's final adoption, a considerably more modest change than the crisis's dramatic outcome might have seemed to demand. But Delegate Corvin, whose earlier caution had proven so precisely prophetic, offered the chamber a closing observation that several colleagues later cited as the reform process's most useful single insight. I would ask this chamber not to mistake modesty of reform for inadequacy of response, she said, in the session that finally adopted the new emergency authority structure. We are not attempting to become a body capable of matching the human administration's own crisis response speed in every circumstance, and I do not believe that is a contest this Concord's founding values would have us enter in the first place. We are attempting, instead, to ensure that this chamber is never again placed in the position of debating, at length and in good faith, an outcome that has already been decided without us. That is a narrower ambition than matching speed for speed, and I believe it is also a considerably wiser one. Commander Resic Dorving, whose own unauthorized detention order had set the entire sequence of events in motion, faced a disciplinary review considerably more severe than his own initial assessment of the situation's consequences had led him to expect. A review that concluded, some months after the incident, with his formal removal from active command and reassignment to a training role within the Concord's Officer Academy, a posting his own service record now described. With a bluntness considerably less diplomatic than the language that had characterized his career's earlier evaluations, as reflecting the Concord's institutional judgment that Commander Dorvain's decision-making pattern, however well-intentioned in its underlying frustration, represents precisely the kind of unilateral overreach this Concord's founding consensus principle was designed to prevent. Dorvain, in an address he gave some years later to a class of newly commissioned Concord officers, as part of his own academy teaching duties, offered an account of the incident considerably more self-critical than his early defense of his own actions had suggested he was capable of. I spent 2 decades believing my own career's slower pace reflected an institutional failure to recognize decisive leadership when it saw it, he told the assembled cadets, in an address that would become, in the years following the Threndell's Rest crisis, a standard component of the Academy's own curriculum on command judgment. I ordered a detention I had no proper authority to order because I had convinced myself, across years of accumulated frustration, that decisive unilateral action represented a virtue this Concord's consensus culture simply failed to properly reward. I want each of you to understand, as clearly as I now understand it myself, exactly what that decision actually cost. Not merely my own career, though it cost that as well, but 6 hours of this Concord's full governing chamber, debating in good faith, at considerable institutional expense. A crisis that had already concluded without any of us, because a neighboring power we had spent generations characterizing as young, cautious, and diplomatically unassertive, turned out to possess a capacity for swift, decisive, and remarkably aimed action that our own institutional confidence had simply never equipped us to anticipate. I would ask you to carry that lesson forward more carefully than I carried my own frustration, that the patience this Concord asks of you is not a failure to recognize your own competence. It is, more often than any of us find comfortable to admit, the only thing standing between a genuine crisis and a considerably worse one you created entirely on your own. Captain Renata Okonkwo, whose own vessel's precise, unhurried retrieval of the 11 detained personnel had done more than any single action to reveal the full extent of the capability gap between the Concord's institutional pace and humanity's own practiced readiness, found herself, in the years following the incident, occasionally called upon to brief newer officers within her own service on exactly the doctrine her response at Threndell's Rest had so decisively demonstrated. People sometimes ask me whether I felt any particular satisfaction Watching the Concord's own after-action reports acknowledge just how completely their deliberative process had been overtaken by events. She told one such briefing some years later. I want to be honest that I did not, and I want to be equally honest about why. The Voss Concord is not, by any measure that actually matters, an adversary this doctrine was built to defeat. Their consensus culture, whatever its limitations in a crisis moving at the speed ours did, has produced 4 centuries of considerably more peaceful governance than most comparable powers in this region can claim. And I have no interest in a doctrine whose success is measured by how thoroughly it embarrasses an institution that gets far more right than it gets wrong. What I felt, watching their own review conclude, was something closer to recognition. The recognition of an institution genuinely willing to examine its own failure honestly, in public, at real cost to its own officers' careers, and its own founders' most cherished principle, rather than simply pretending the failure had never occurred. I have encountered considerably fewer institutions willing to do that, across my own career, than I would like, and I think that willingness, more than any gap in response speed, is the thing actually worth learning from what happened at Threndell's Rest. Priya Anand, the human refueling administrator whose calm, methodical initial response had set the entire resolution in motion, continued her own posting at Threndell's Rest for a further 3 years following the crisis, working alongside a newly assigned, conquered administrative counterpart, whose own approach to the human contingent under her jurisdiction bore little resemblance to Commander Dorvain's accumulated resentment. I think what people misunderstand, when they hear this story told as a tale of human capability catching an overconfident empire by surprise, is that the actual work of preventing the next Threndell's Rest was never going to happen in some dramatic 6-hour window. She told a colleague, some years after the incident, in an interview conducted for her own colonial administration's internal training materials. It happens in the years of unremarkable, patient relationship building before any crisis ever begins, the kind of work that produces an administrator on the other side of the desk from you who trusts your good faith enough to actually pick up the channel and try to resolve a problem before it becomes 6 hours of chamber debate in the first place. Captain Okonkwo's response was necessary because Commander Dorvain made it necessary. But I would rather this Concord remember Threndell's Rest as proof that swift capability matters most as a backstop for exactly the kind of slow, patient trust building that prevents you from ever needing it, not as proof that speed alone is the lesson worth drawing from what happened there. The 11 seconds of dead air captured by the Voss Concord's own archival systems in the moment presiding Delegate Thal first announced that the detained personnel had already been released. 11 seconds during which not a single delegate in a chamber built across 4 centuries, specifically, to ensure that careful, collective deliberation always preceded consequential action, found anything at all to say, remains in the Concord's own official historical curriculum. The single recording every incoming delegate is required to review before taking their own seat in the chamber. It is not shown to teach new delegates that speed should replace deliberation, and the Concord's own instructors are careful, in every session where the recording is presented, to state that lesson explicitly before the silence is ever allowed to play. It is shown instead to teach a narrower, more durable truth, one that presiding Delegate Thal herself insisted be recorded as the recording's official framing before she left office some years later, that an institution's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability are, more often than any founding charter likes to admit, exactly the same trait, viewed from 2 different distances in time. and that the only real defense against discovering that fact the hard way, in a silence 11 seconds long, is the humility to ask, honestly and often, whether the crisis in front of you is still waiting for your careful judgment, or whether it has already, quietly, moved on without you.